about you guys or if it was my computer, but it was like, it sounds like, old school faxes coming through. I don't know what kind of technology we tapped into right there, but regardless, this is the Crazy Stupid Marketing Show. Welcome to the show, everybody. Hopefully you're not having weird robotic noises in the background, but hey, what are you gonna do? We stream live and stuff happens. Welcome to the Crazy Stupid Marketing Show. For those of you who are joining us for the first time, welcome. For those of us who are joining us for the second or multiple time, welcome. We're so excited to see you back. And let me give you a little overview of what the Crazy Stupid Marketing Show is. It's a place where we have conversations about marketing things. It is not a place where people come to get answers per se, but it is a place where we can come and explore together ideas, things that work for people, things that don't work for people, so that we can get to the place where we can figure out what works for us. And whether you are representing an individual today, because we are talking about the power of networking, which is totally relevant for individuals and not just businesses or business owners, or you're representing a business from a marketing capacity, we're super happy to have you in the conversation. And if you notice the little fancy chat mechanism that's over on the side, we would love to hear your voice as part of the conversation. So ask your questions about networking, I don't know, do you ask? I think you only ask questions. You could ask more things. You could ask your opinions. Share your opinions is what I was going for with that. Share your opinions, share your experiences. We have all of the things that we can talk about, so especially Xenia and I when it comes to networking. So anything in particular you would like to explore today, joining us live, please share it in the comments and we can take it in any direction we need to for today. I started this show really weird today. It's like I haven't said any of the normal things that I say, but like if you've ever seen the show before, then you know the normal things I say. And if you haven't seen the show before, you don't know the normal things I say, and you might think this is normal. So now I'm not sure where I was going with that. But anyway, let's get right into the conversation, shall we? Because I'm all over the place. Let's learn a little bit more about my lovely co-host for today, Xenia. Xenia, would you like to introduce yourself to the crew and share with us why networking has been so powerful for you?
Yeah, so thank you for having me. I mean, even us like leading up to this, I was like, oh my gosh, I feel like we could just chat forever. And I know that there's like a cutoff, and I'm like, I want to talk to you before, I want to talk to you after, because we're just really good at talking. So that's how I would start that. I think even like I've like networked by accident, and I think that that's actually been a really positive thing in the sense of like I've done it for the right reasons, and I haven't done it with like ulterior motives. And that's actually what's led to really good things coming from it. Like even today, for instance, it's kind of funny. Like right before this, and I was like, okay, I have a hard cutoff. Like and traffic in the GTA is really bad. But I had lunch with David Young from LinkedIn. So like today is a perfect example of networking in real life. He lives in Indianapolis. He's here for a few days. He's been posting about it on LinkedIn. So if you follow him, you could go check it out and see what he's been doing in Toronto. And if you don't follow him, go follow him, David Young. And so like a couple hours ago, I was like literally doing an in-person networking with one other person that I met on LinkedIn that I would have never met before. I have another sad story about networking from a couple of weeks ago, and then another exciting one for August. So I'm also really good friends with Colleen Saringer, Dr. Colleen, who, again, if you don't follow her, you should follow her. She's lovely. And she lives in Atlanta, but is from Ohio. And somehow in a comment, we had talked about the fact that my husband and I and her husband and her want to go to as many ballparks as possible. And she's like, have we talked about this? And I was like, no, how have we not talked about this? So they planned a trip to Toronto, the impetus being to meet us and go to the Jays game because they were playing Cleveland. It was Father's Day. And that was when my whole family and I got sick. So we didn't end up actually getting to go. But I sent two friends in my stead. I was like, I have these tickets. It's Father's Day. So like, I can't really sell them the morning of. Do you want to go? And I found two friends that wanted to go. And I was like, okay, well, you're going to go meet these lovely people that I've never met in person, but I love them. And you're going to represent me and have some drinks and have fun and like be friends with them. And they were. And I think even that to me is like shows the power of market or like networking in general of like, you never know where it's going to take you. And that was like a really crappy way for that to turn out. And that was like the most disappointing part about being sick. But the fact that I was still able to like get two people to go that had never met these people, and now they're friends, and they were like joking about meeting up again in August for like another trip for a concert. And I was like, do it. That would be so much fun. I won't be here, so I can't join you, but like be friends and do it without me. So I think I've always like kind of approached it in that sense of like, I just decide I want to be friends with someone, and I'm like, okay, so we should be friends. So like, let's meet or let's hang out or let's talk again. And it's led to positive things. And I think doing it for the right reasons is what's really important. And if you're trying to go into it with an ulterior motive of like, what can you get out of it and how are you going to benefit, then I think you kind of go into it with the wrong mindset. And I think that that's like a big key is like, I never go into it with the assumption that it's going to turn out to be anything other than like, oh, this could be fun. And if it's like awkward, okay, it's awkward and we move on. And if it's not, then it's like, now I have a new friend. Like even our first one, I was like, we talked for like an hour and a half, I feel like. We
At least.
Let's keep doing it. Like, let's have another one. Let's talk again. And so I feel like when you go into it with that mindset and that approach, like it only comes out with positive things, even if you can't predict or see what those positive things will be when you're going into it.
Okay. So there's like all of the things we can talk about. So again, folks, if you listen to Xenia's intro, we're like, there's something I want to specifically touch on there. Please put it in the chat. We would love, because I got like 3 different directions I can go. So I'm going to throw them all out there and we'll see which one we land on. I think a lot of times when people think about networking, they think about it from a business transaction perspective. But I also feel like on the flip side of that, we have a global pandemic of loneliness. And so we have all these lonely people not networking because they think networking is only solely for business transactions, but we're actually, it's kind of becoming a self-fulfilling prophecy because we won't allow networking, quote unquote, to be anything more than that. And Xenia, what you're talking about is not, I mean, like you might create business opportunities. It's totally possible. But the intention is not that. The intention is more so that friends making, relationship building, supporting each other's scenarios. So I know you have a background in like big corporate work environments too. So like how would you say you look at networking differently now than you used to before? And what are the pros and cons?
I think in like the bigger corporate world, it did feel more forced in the sense of like you had big vendors that you worked with, or there's like bigger stakeholders that you're involved with. So it was almost more forced, even friendships or like kind of that organic versus like a real organic, true kind of like relationship to build out of it. And I think sometimes by happenstance, you also got that in the bigger world, but I think it was harder to come by and it did feel more forced. And even though like sometimes maybe the stakes were higher or even like the rewards were better, for lack of a better word, in the sense of like the networking was like at a Toronto Leaf or like a hockey game, for instance, in like the suite where like you would never afford to go that on your own. So it's like, it feels like a bigger experience. But then I would argue that the relationships are more surface level, where it's like when it's one-on-one and you're trying to like build those relationships for potential, work in business or whatever down the road, then I feel like the organic side of it comes out a lot easier. For me, at least, it was a lot easier to make that. And like, I go into it with very open mind, but I think I also like realize early on, if I am connecting with someone or I feel like there is that connection on both sides, then I'm automatically kind of thinking, okay, how can we help each other? And again, not from like that super business mindset, but almost like, who else could I introduce them to that could be helpful for their conversations or relationships? Or like, and I've thrown it out there a few times. I'm like, I don't know what this looks like, but maybe there's a chance like that we could work together. And that's actually paid off a couple of times in work. One example is like from even a couple of years ago, like within the first year when I left like the corporate world, I was doing some work for like a small plumber, like a local business. He wanted to scale his business. So I was helping him do that. And then through him, I got introduced to the digital agency that he was working with at the time. And I just kind of put it out there. I was like, I don't know what this looks like, but maybe I can help you. And he was like, yeah, maybe. And then from then on, I also did some freelance work for him. So even though I went into it with like no ulterior motive and no intentions, it often ends up leading to something working out in an organic way, which then just feels so natural and so easy, where I feel like in the bigger corporate space, it's less likely for it to feel kind of as easy.
And I think too, because I'm looking at this from a marketing perspective, right? Like how people can use networking as a marketing quote unquote tactic.
Hmm.
And the thing is, when you're looking at deliverables from a business perspective, so we'll just use marketing, right? I got a KPI of meeting X amount of people. I remember going to an event once, and my boss, jokingly, but I took it very seriously, we were in New York City, and she was like, "You can't come back to Canada unless you have 10 business cards in your pocket." So I was like, I mean, so what did I do? I ran around the room and I was like, "My boss says I can't go home unless I get your business card. Will you give it to me?" Although I will tell you, it was like hands down a differentiator from a standing out from the crowd perspective, which actually
Yeah.
led to, I think, more meaningful conversations because you had like kind of a soft opener. But I want to talk about this because I think from a networking perspective, I don't, ulterior motive sounds a little bit like
Yes. Yeah. For yes.
like evil villain kind
Yep.
of thing. But like at the end of the day, we all want to use our time wisely. So we want to talk to people, have coffee chats, go to networking events that make sense and quote unquote pay off
Yep.
in the long run. So Xenia, how have you found a balance between making sure these things turn into meaningful experiences, but also not creating so strict of a framework in terms of what this has to be in order to create those opportunities?
Totally. I mean, yes, ulterior motive is like, for lack of a better word, in that sense, I think, and like that, I feel like is kind of like that big corporate world of mentality of like, oh, we're going to this event to do this thing, and it
Right.
does
I've
feel
got a
like it.
trade show booth so I can
Yeah,
generate leads.
exactly. And I think it definitely is a balance, and I think honestly, I probably lean on the side where I'm like maybe spending too much time, and that not to my own detriment, because like to me I'm like, oh, I made a new friend, like now you're my new friend, and like this could be good, who knows when it's going to be good. So but I think I would definitely like err on the side of maybe like too loose with my time currently, just because I like to talk to people. But I think going into it, like I in like a first coffee chat, for instance, like I always just go into it of like, okay, this is fun, it's half an hour, I get to meet someone new. And I think you can usually tell pretty quickly if you're kind of like vibing with the person or if you guys are getting along. And so in my mind, as long as that's happening, I'm kind of always thinking, okay, like I want to schedule at least one more. And even in that second one, kind of use that more of like the jumping off period of like, okay, now we know like a little bit more about each other's businesses or like what we're doing or who we want to meet and where could that lead. So kind of that next one is always like a bit more planning, I think, in my mind of like, okay, where could we take this? And not to say that I don't ever want to talk to them again, because like, if I like them, then I do want to talk to them. I keep talking to them. But I also want to make that one more useful of like, what could be the next steps? Like, is there a potential partnership? Is there somebody that I can introduce you to? Like, what could be that connection point that makes that second call kind of like, again, for lack of a better word, useful? And I think often people like, at the end is like, how can I support you and stuff like that. And what I like to do in lieu of that, which I mean is essentially a similar situation, is always just say like, I have a good network of people. So like, I want to send a few introductions your way. Is there a couple of people, like a certain types of people that you're interested in meeting? Like, do you need more copywriters in your network? Do you need more like brand people? And kind of within that, depending on where they are in their business, if they're looking for partnerships or collaborations, then I can usually think of like a couple of people. I'm like, oh, I think you two would get along well. You could help each other or at least know each other. And that's always what I like to end the first one off with is like, what's one or two people I can introduce you to at least kind of keep that web moving. Like in my mind, it's like this big spider web or like DNA map of like all these different connection points. And there's like, then you realize like what a small world it can be, which is also really fun. And at least spread that web one more angle with every person I talk to.
Mm-hmm. It was like one of my favorite things. This happened to me once where someone was like, "Oh my God," she introduced me to this guy. And I was like, "Oh my gosh, we're already friends." Like, this is the best intro. You vibed both of us accurately because we already like each other and hang out.
Yes.
But like, okay, so let's talk about this because now we've kind of gone from just networking for our own personal relationships to this wider ecosystem of networking for introductions. Um, we both vibe in this similar place, right? I believe that introductions can solve problems. So if I can make an introduction, I want to make an introduction. But I had this really interesting experience, probably about 3 months ago now. And I had somebody who had been like coming to my in-person networking events and things like that. So I know him decently well. He sent me an email asking me like very specific. I'm looking to be introduced to agency owners who have XYZ in terms of clients, blah, blah. And my brain went, I have to know someone that fits that profile, right? Like I know a lot of people, I have to know, but I couldn't. Like there was nothing that like jumped out at me in terms of like an introduction. The next day, I had a second conversation with a lady. Her and I had a great conversation, and we had one of those just like human catching up conversations. She had been at a conference and she had gone to this panel conversation about late diagnosed women with autism, and she's got a community where she helps the mental health type of things. And so she's just sharing this without the ask, right? She's not asking me to introduce her to late diagnosed women with autism, right? Like, but she's sharing with me her interest in these things. And in that, it was about, 8-10 minutes, she like shared what she is up to right now. I thought of 5 different people I wanted to introduce her to, either based on the vibe or the story or what she was interested in and that I knew about them. So like, are these people who would be quote unquote prime ideal targets for her community? No, but she would be interested in talking to them because they have the same type of interest or they have an experience in an area that she has interest. And so from a networking perspective, I know a lot of times, especially if you go to a networking event where people are like, pitch for 40 seconds and tell me who you want to be introduced to. And it only is related to the like, I'll call them business demographics, right? So like company size, job title, those types of things. What are we missing out? I feel like we're missing out on all the good stuff that actually makes me feel like I want to introduce you to somebody.
Yes, I never. That's so funny because I think that's like a perfect example. When I'm even saying that or suggesting that, I was like, this is probably the best way I can currently help you, especially like side note anecdotally, which I'm also like kind of on mat leave and have an 8-month-old who's like not here right now, which is lovely. But she usually is. So my capacity is limited right now. And I never think about it from like that, the business demographics, for instance. Like I'm just like, I like you and I think I have a good read on people. And so it's more usually when I am suggesting people to them, it's people that I think will match well together in terms of how they would get along. I'm like, ooh, there are some overlap here and I think it will work really well. Even for instance, this one, I was like so annoyed at myself after the fact because it took me months to figure it out. But it was 2 people that were like, they were both veterans. They had like a lot of other commonalities. And I'd had multiple conversations with both of them. And then all of a sudden I was like, how did I not think of this before? Like, why you guys should meet. And they met and it went really, really well. But it was never about like a business demographic at that point. I was just like, oh, I don't know how I didn't think of this before, but like you guys should definitely meet. And I think that's always how I think about it. It's like, who do I like? But I think like I can pull just even like commonalities out or personality traits that I think will match well. And to me, that's like what you are missing out on when you're thinking of like, oh, if they don't fit this box, then we're not going to do it. It's like, well, get rid of the box and you'll probably find a lot more people that you actually want to meet.
Well, and then there's also, again, a kind of balance, right? I think really more what we need to do is redefine the box because I feel like if people like absolutely no boundaries, then they will introduce you to some terrible people. You feel like you waste your time in conversation. And like personally, I don't want to have a reputation of making bad introductions. I don't want to have a reputation of making good, meaningful introductions for people. And so I think the shift is in moving away from these business demographics or demographics of whatever kind. Like, I'm going to introduce you because, although I feel like when moms meet moms, it's very minimally we have something to talk about. But like, what I've started to do when people ask me, how can I help you? or like, how can I support you? I'm like, okay, so you today have experienced my vibe. Okay. If you know somebody who matches that vibe, I would like to know them. Okay. And I don't care what their job title, I don't care if they're a solopreneur, they work in corporate, or they're a mom, or they're not. I don't care. If you think their vibe will match mine, then I want to have a conversation with them. Because if someone's vibe matches mine, that's where potential is. Whether
Yes.
it's business potential or friendship potential or partnership or referral, like that's my people. I want to refer people. I want to be friends with my people. I want to have my people as my clients. Right? I don't want to have not my people. I want to have as many of my people around me as possible. And so I think this is interesting too, though, because then a lot of people will be like, maybe they're not used to paying attention to vibe, right? Maybe they have their like pre-configured questions. I'm sure you have these conversations too, Xenia, where you're going and like clearly answering a set of pre-established questions. Ask everyone, and I'm not necessarily opposed to that. But at the same time, once it's become an interaction has become programmed to that state, kind of like a pitch, how much interaction is actually happening now? How much are we allowing our energies to feed off of each other and to like go where the conversation takes us today, which is one of my favorite things about this show. You never really know. But like, it's almost like we have to each create our own framework for making it work, but also making sure that that framework leaves space for possibility, flexibility, all of things.
Yeah. And I think it is a balance, right? Like when I first started doing them on LinkedIn, I was nervous. Like, it's like, I don't know this person. What if we don't have anything to talk about? What if it's like that awkward silence when you don't know them? So I would almost like my predefined box then was just like at least thinking of like, okay, if it starts getting awkward or like there's like nothing to talk about, like what could I bring up that could share it? And then I think I just like once I let that go a little bit, then it just became easier to have that kind of organic movement to like where like our first one, right? Like where did the conversation go? We definitely knew we wanted to talk again. And it was more about that energy and just like, oh, like you just at the end of the call, I could basically be like, yep, I like that person. Or like, not even that I don't like them, but just like maybe we're not the best, maybe it's not the best vibe or best energy, and that's totally fine. And as soon as you know it's a good energy and a good vibe, then it's exactly that. Like, how do I keep them in my circle? How do I expand my circle to like for more of my people that to meet them? And I think I never really thought of myself as like a networker. And then a few people have like joked, they're like, oh, you know everyone on LinkedIn. I was like, I do not. Like, what are you talking about? And then they'd say something, I'm like, oh, that's my friend. Oh, that's my friend. Like, I've had coffee, like a virtual coffee with them or whatever. And I was like, maybe I do know some people. And I think it
depends on the circle you run in, right?
Correct.
Once you start to run in vibe circles, then like generally people attract each other, right? Which
yes.
Not unusual.
And I think like I do it in my like personal friendship life as well. Like even the instance of like sending my friends to this baseball game with people that I've never met in person. I was like, I just want, like, it sucks that I can't go. And I was bummed, but I was like, I just want someone to enjoy the opportunity to meet Colleen. Like, I love her. And that to me was more disappointing than like, no, like I didn't even care about the money or anything. I just wanted someone to enjoy it. And I think I've like, even where I had a friend that moved to New York for a few years. So like anytime people were going to New York, and she's also very outgoing and friendly. And I was like, oh, you should go hang out with my friend. Cause like, she's lovely and you're lovely. So like, why wouldn't you want to hang out together? And I don't think everyone thinks that way. And I think that piece is what I've taken to networking in marketing or business or for like progression. I've taken that same idea of like, well, I like you and I like you. So why shouldn't you two like each other and like carry on this space? And at a base level, I think that's kind of it of where the foundation starts for me.
Yeah. Well, okay. So let's talk about sharing is caring because I do feel if you're looking at networking as if it is this, I'm going to a trade show, I have to get X amount of leads, or even I'm going to a networking event and I'm going for business purposes, or I'm going to expense this to my business, then I should get some numbers, right? I feel like once we are focused so heavily on that number, on that deliverable, that we also tend to be like kind of greedy in terms of the leads. And I've seen this happen even like between sales teams, right? And there's a lot of problems with the way sales teams are structured that makes it competitive. But like the whole point here is that like people know us. I don't have to like, just because someone knows me doesn't mean they can't also know you, right? You can know both of us. And again, I don't think if people like really stopped to think whether or not this makes sense, and then like this lead or this connection is mine, this is like it's not in a like, now I'm going into a different, now there's like this an ownership component and a belonging component. So not the belonging component, right? We can belong with lots of people, but this ownership is not like, well, you can only be Tracy's friend and you can't be Xenia's friend. Right? Like you can't. And this is a thing too, like I wonder if it is just a mindset, because I remember like when I was young, I had lots of different groups of friends, right? Work friends, and I had baseball friends, and I had high school friends, and I used to do these like big house parties, and I would invite everyone. And it would be like my favorite thing when like a random high school friend was then friends with like a baseball friend. And then you're like, this is great. I made this happen, right? Like, good. Let's make the world go round. But I think when we look at it again from a business perspective, we start to get a little maybe greedy.
Yeah.
And like holding this for ourselves.
Totally. It's interesting because one, that's also like my greatest joy in life. I'm like, oh my gosh, this is like, you guys are now friends. And like, I mean, I must admit, I probably do have a little bit of FOMO sometimes, especially if they like live far away, but I like connect to them. I'm like, I'm so happy, but like, I'm also so sad that I'm not going to be there too. But I think it's funny because I'm naturally like, I'm a very competitive person. So that part of it normally I think would appeal to me, but in a networking sense, it's like the complete opposite, because I actually think to be in that mindset, one, I would not be as natural or myself, which then I think is like to my own detriment. And that part of it with people feels really icky to me. Like I think a good example of that competition in a different industry is like realtors, and they're often very like, well, you can't be friends with this person or this person if they're my past client, and it's very competitive and versus like a working together. Whereas like, as competitive as I am, I actually think in the dynamic of this, it's like, we'll work better together. Like my idea is going to be better if I talk about it and get someone else's opinion and input, and like obviously not everything is equal and all of those things removed. It's a better dynamic to be together and to have more spider webs intermingling and commingling, especially when the energies do align. So I think like for me, going into it kind of with that, if I do go into it with like a competitive mindset, it's like such to my own detriment, because I just don't feel like I'm myself at all. And I think like, I always joke with my husband, I'm like, obviously not everyone likes me, but I was like, I feel like when you meet me in person, like I'm better in person, or like, than just like over email or whatever. I'm like, then I feel like you sometimes like me. And I think if I get in that mindset, it's the opposite. And I'm just like stiff and not myself. And then what are you like getting out of that? How many leads? You know what I mean? Like it has the opposite effect. And I feel like that would be true for a lot of people, because I think like when you're not yourself, then even if the energies do feel like they're aligning, they're not going to be the right energies, because you're not even being yourself.
That's not your energy. So it doesn't matter that it's aligned with that person, because it's not you.
Exactly.
This is like, and Dan is sharing a similar sentiment here. It says, you can always tell the people who have contact card targets at conferences and trade shows, the conversations seem a lot less organic and often much more rushed.
Yes.
And the thing that I also find interesting about this is that there's a lot of fear that plays into this, right? So people, I mean, like me as a young, I didn't actually think my boss wasn't going to let us come back to Canada. We didn't get 10 business cards. But like, one, also if someone gives me a challenge, I have every intention of completing that challenge and doing it first. So I will win. I'm like you, I have a competitive streak. There's definitely competition, but the thing that I don't think anybody goes into this thinking about the relationship. Because if we thought about the relationship between, I'm going to create this target, but in so doing, I am increasing the likelihood that I'm going to have less organic conversations and more rushed ones because I'm trying to get in more, then is that what I would choose, right? If we were actually thinking about the combination of those things, would we choose that? And then there's an interesting thing to look at. Like right now, I get to network on behalf of myself. I don't have any organization that's maintaining how many contacts I make and blah, blah, blah. So if I want to go to a networking event and have conversations with 2 people, I'll go to a networking event and have 2 meaningful conversations.
Yep.
2 more meaningful conversations than I had yesterday. So that sounds good. But I remember having a conversation with a friend of mine. We were at this like gala event, and he is an executive director for a nonprofit. And he went to talk to one of like this guy who was an investor. And the investor was just like, okay, pitch me, you have 5 minutes. And I was like, I mean, if that was me, I would have been like, that is not how I have conversations. So thank you, but no, I will let you talk to the next person. I'm not here to be on your 5-minute timer, right? Like, and so it doesn't necessarily mean that you're always going to have like full control of that, because other people have their experience and the way that they create that experience to happen. But also in going into it, looking at the like, what would I do? Right? Would I do that? Am I actually the type of person who would try to rush through one conversation just to get to another conversation that may or may not be more valuable than that first conversation? Like, I don't know that. And if I have one really meaningful conversation, could that person introduce me to like 10 other people because they bothered to have that? So I didn't have to go and spend my time meeting 11 people. I had to spend my time with one person. And so I think there's a lot of things that play into this, right? Like extroverted versus introverted and all of these types of things. And I don't think there's one right answer. But when we look at it as like, what would I do? And we can pay attention to when we're in those conversations, like Dan outlined, and we realize like, wow, this like does not feel good for me at all, that we create the space for us to do something different, or at least experiment with something different.
Exactly. I think it's like, you can't see the forest through the trees sometime, right? It's like you're set on that, and then that becomes your goal, which then clouds how you act and interact and all of that stuff. And even like The Power of Luck, it's like a book by this, I'm going to forget his name. It will come to me later. But anyways, he studied luck for like 10 years of like self-proclaimed.
Is it the luck surface area guy?
Yeah, I love him. Okay, I'm going to look it up quickly. Well, okay.
I love this concept. I just recently learned about this concept of luck surface area, and I was like, oh my gosh, this is genius.
Yeah, okay, by Richard Wiseman. It's a really good book. He studied self-proclaimed lucky and unlucky people for like 10 years. And then he ended up finding like there was like 4 main principles that like contribute to a lucky life. You obviously have a lot of control over it. But within each principle is like sub-principles. And like the biggest takeaway for me is like that the first principle is like be open to like creating, finding and taking opportunities as they come in terms of like interaction with people specifically. And like one stat that sticks out of my mind is like most people know about 300 people by name. So he's like, you're at like a dinner party, for instance, you're one handshake away from like 90,000 possibilities. Cause like if that one person who knows 300 people tells one person about you, then that's like, how many more opportunities is that creating? So like, even just going into it with that mindset, I think would be a different type of like, why am I going to rush through this conversation when like, if this person's interesting and fun to talk to, like I have a million questions for them. So like, if anything, they're probably cutting me off because they're like, Xenia, you need to stop asking me questions. I mean, even my friends come for dinner and like, they'll have gone on a trip and I'll be like, okay, sit down. I made you a nice dinner because now I have 1,000 questions for you after 15 years of friendship. So like, that's just me. I'm nosy and curious. So like, I ask a bunch of stuff, but you don't need to have 50 people that you're meeting there and have that goal to, I think, get maybe even something more positive out of it. So like you're saying, just having that space where it doesn't have to like redefining that box and what that box looks like within, again, what everyone is comfortable with and what works for you, because there are differences there, right? Like I sometimes feel less extroverted than other days and stuff like that. And sometimes like Zoom calls are harder versus in person. And so it fluctuates just even in terms of like person to person and day to day. But I think like redefining what that box can look like and not having so many like predetermined labels of like only this is going to equal this outcome. Because I definitely don't rush through mine, and I've still had pretty good opportunities that have come from it so far. So I mean, I'm going to keep doing what I'm doing until it stops working, I guess.
Well, and I think I want to dive a little deeper into something you like kind of glanced over there, Xenia, which is this idea of creating opportunities. Okay? So like investing enough into the relationship to create an opportunity, and maybe that's a business opportunity, or maybe it's a sushi date. Like who knows? But like I think a lot of times we sit, and again, specifically from a marketing perspective, everybody's obsessed with like the inbound, right? I'm gonna like serve this out to the market, and then all these inbound leads are just gonna come and buy my stuff. That would be magical if that is actually a thing that happens. The thing is that opportunities, they're not like fruit on a tree. Even though we talk about low hanging fruit, we're gonna go pick things. Like we have to grow that, right? Yes. We participate in the growing, and so I'd love to hear from your perspective what that looks like from a networking perspective to actually participate in creating opportunities instead of like digging for opportunities.
Yeah, I definitely think that's like a big piece, and I think that is, I would say, probably one of the harder aspects of it. And I think where a lot of people maybe feel like it isn't working or that they want to give up. And I think I look at this in more ways than just networking, marketing in general, and like building a business and stuff. It's like, this is the time, and forever there's a time where you do things that don't scale. Even if you want to scale, like there's avenues for that. There's ways to do that, paid and unpaid, and all of that. But regardless, at the end of the day, like it's people to people, it's like human connection. And I don't feel like that is like scalable in the sense of like automation and all these things that are like obviously very important to business and are going to change how business works. But you can't like fake that with a human connection. And I think that that is where those opportunities, where you end up creating them. Because I think people can, after a time or two, if you are having like recurring conversations with people, you can, even if you think you've got a good vibe and then like something doesn't feel right, you can usually kind of suss it out of like, oh, that's not what they're really here for. They're not actually, trying to build a relationship that could go somewhere or could maybe not go somewhere or anything like that. So I think it's really about investing time with people and within reason and within what works for you. Like, I don't think it's like, oh, I have to give up 30 hours a week to networking or my business isn't going to grow or my marketing efforts aren't going to pay off. But I don't think it's like a one and done, like, oh, I got my 10 business cards, I can go back to Canada and carry on my merry way. Like, you have to then fuel that. And I think that that's where opportunities are created. Like sending one message to someone. I mean, going back to marketing, you have to see a message 7 times or, however many times for it to be effective. And going back to like big corporate world of having like a reach frequency where we're trying to reach X amount of population, X amount of times, like 15 to 20 times in a campaign. It's the same thing. Like someone's not going to just remember one interaction with you, especially if it's brief and it's like a card exchange or something like that. So I think like actually caring about the person or like being interested in asking them like what they like to do that's not work related or like stuff about their life or just like getting to know them a little bit takes time. And I think once you're making that investment for the right reasons, then that relationship usually grows organically, as do the creation of opportunities. Because I think that's where a lot of the underlying trust comes in. And as soon as you trust someone, of course, you're going to want to recommend them or talk about them or think about them more often, which is all beneficial to the other 300 people that they're meeting or knowing on a regular basis.
Right. And so for me, I have this rule of marketing that I like to live by about getting people to say yes. Marketing's job is to get people to say yes to things. Right? I want to sign up for this email list, or I want to click on this thing, or like all of these are yes actions. So I want to have people who are doing yes things. And so for me, networking really is about like, how much can I give somebody so that when I ask them to have another call with me, they're like, yes, I know that that's going to be a good use of my time. I'm definitely going to have another call with Tracy. I think this would be interesting if more people use this as the KPI and just say like, at the end of the day, if you meet somebody and you don't want to have any other conversations with them, the vibe is off or whatever, that's fine. You control that. You don't need them to say yes. But how do you reveal enough about yourself so that somebody would say, yeah, that would make sense for me to have another conversation with you. I learned enough in this conversation, or I experienced an energy exchange, or that was fun for me, that I would like to do that again. Again, to me, it's like, who would say yes? And like, what percentage of people that you offer that to will say yes? And how high of a percentage of that? And again, it's not necessarily coming back to like, have to have a number that is fueling all of these things, but that it's an interesting number to look at that I think most people and companies are not looking at from a networking perspective, because especially if you have some kind of complex sales, or you have, like, I mostly do custom packages for people, right? So like, if I'm going to do a custom package for you, I got to have like probably at least 2 more calls with you to see if there's like even going to make sense to do a thing. So if I've got to get you to say yes to me 2 more times to even get to a place where I can write a proposal or create some kind of business, I better get you saying yes the first. Because me just handing you a brochure at a trade show booth is not going to get somebody to say yes.
Totally.
So like, I just love to hear your thoughts on that, Xenia. And again, I'm like, the point being with networking to create the opportunity to move someone to the next stage.
The next yes. This is going to be very personal and like not going to work for some people. But I think that for me, the easiest way to create that opportunity or create that space is to be a bit vulnerable, because I think that then opens, allows them to feel that way as well. And maybe it's not on the first call, maybe that's down the road, or maybe never, but I think it opens a space where that, if they felt comfortable, then that would allow it. And I know that that's not what everybody's going to be able to do, and people aren't comfortable with that. And I mean, it's not like I share my whole life or like everything personal, but I think the open to that vulnerability is what allows that to be, because you're exactly right. Like, it's, how do we say yes to the next call, and on that second call or third or whatever, like, how do we say yes to the next thing that we want out of this? And maybe that is a sushi date as friends, or maybe that is a business thing. Like, regardless of what it is a yes is what you need out of it, right? And yeah, so I think for me, it's definitely like a vulnerable factor, which I think is really hard for people. And I think that that's why some people then either overthink it or try and go into it with like almost too many metrics, because it's like, okay, if I can take the emotion out of it, then I can do X, Y, and Z, because that's what my fulfillment, like, that's what I have to do. Those are my deliverables. But then that doesn't allow that human connection, I feel like. And that's where the creation of opportunities, I feel like, comes from.
And this is really interesting that we moseyed here to this part of the conversation, because I had a call earlier today where we were talking about LinkedIn profiles and how, like, over time people might talk about different things, right? Like, I used to work in corporate and work with a lot of insurance companies, so I created a lot of content that was related to insurance, which, apologies to those of you out there who love insurance. I'm thankful for you, so you can love insurance, because I don't. It's not my number one love. And I taught cardio dance, and I have had a mom blog, and I've had like all of these things existed at one point or another in my 16-year LinkedIn journey. So for one, people don't go that far back, just so you know, friends. Like, nobody's trying that hard, so don't worry about it too much. But in your own personal evolution, there are different things and different interests that we have. And
Mhm.
I believe we are all multidimensional, even if some people have more dimensions than other, we
Mhm.
all have multi dimensions. And there's, I have this theory about the vulnerability is that the more dimensions you reveal, the more vulnerable you seem, the
Mhm.
more human you seem to people. So that
Mhm.
doesn't necessarily mean that I deep dive my experience as a mom, or I deep dive my experience in corporate, or I deep dive my experience as a sister, right? But I use it. I use it as it's relevant. And so because people see lots of peeks into lots of parts of me,
Mhm.
then they seem to know me. And they probably think they know me better than they actually know me. But this is the like step, again, step towards a yes. So if I was going to say, hey, like, do you want to hop on a call and have a conversation and see where it goes? People are like, oh yeah, you seem authentic. You seem like you're not going to sell me anything, right? So like, I will give that a try. But then that's very much tied into like, again, the human factor, right?
Mhm.
Like, I don't show up as TLB coaching
Mhm.
on LinkedIn. I show up as Tracy Borison.
Mhm.
And I'm Tracy Borison, and I have friends, and I have coworkers, and I have a spouse, and I have like lots of different relationships with lots of different people. I don't know which one you might fit into today. Not spouse, sorry folks, that one's taken. But like, who knows, right? Who knows where this can go? But there also is that like kind of just like what you were saying with the vulnerability is that like this is a real person, and that if
Mhm.
I do say yes to this, because the first yes is the most risky yes, then like I've done some work to mitigate that risk by showing you who I am.
Mhm.
And this is the big key point here, that what I've shown you matches what you experience.
Yes.
Because if what I've shown you and what you experience don't vibe, then the likelihood of that turning into a yes and or a trust relationship down the line is very, very low.
Yes. I'd say for that, like one other point as well. So that I think is a huge part of it is like if you've had it, if you've seen enough of someone online and then you have a call with them, then I always kind of go like some preset expectation. Am I trying to be like that? No. Is that human nature? Yes. I'm like, well, I've seen enough of them. I'm like, I kind of think that they're like this. So when they match up to it, I'm like, cool, you're who I thought you were. This is great. I'm digging it. Or the opposite when they're not. And then it's like, oh, okay, that gives you pause. And then I'd also say about different, like, different peaks and aspects into your life. To me, that's a big piece as well, because it's like, all you need with someone is to find one point of connection,
Mhm.
and then everything else can flow and transfer into that energy and okay, cool, and grow. But I think like you just need a point of connection. So if they've seen, okay, cardio dance, mom, spouse, all like business owner, they've seen all these different points instead of just one, then it's just much easier to find that one point of connection. Like I feel like every call I get on, I can be like, if I've looked at their profile for like 5 minutes and like done a little, like it's not like I'm, spending hours learning about them before a half an hour coffee call when I don't really know them, but it's like, oh, we went to the same school, or like I know someone that did that. Like you can usually find even one thing to like jump off the conversation, which then I feel like makes them feel more comfortable and it just becomes easier. And like for me, the biggest thing of vulnerability online was the death of my mom. Like that experience was the catalyst to get me here. So it's so intertwined with what my story and experience is, but it was also very traumatic. And I initially didn't think I would ever share it online because it feels very personal. It's been just over 2 years and it still feels very like fresh and personal. But I do once in a while. I don't make a huge point of it. It's like a peek, right? It's like a little peek behind the curtain. But I've also said to some people on calls, depending on how it's going and stuff, I'm like, I wouldn't be here if she was still alive. Like, so how can she not be part of this story?
Right.
And sometimes it's a hard thing to talk about. Some people are very uncomfortable. So it's not like I want to get into it deep with someone I don't know either. But it is the truth of it. Like if she was still alive, would I still be at my old job doing what I was doing 3 years ago? Probably not. But like, would I be here? I can pretty confidently say no, because it was a huge shift in my life that made me reevaluate a lot of things and make a big changes. So it's hard not to talk about it. But I also think it's still, even if I talk about it, there's still so much, it's like an iceberg, so much below the surface that no one will ever know, because it's such a personal experience, and especially something like very traumatic, filled with grief. Like there's so many layers to it. But it's interesting because initially I didn't think I would even ever say it. And now I feel like it just doesn't make sense, because like if in the conversations where people have kind of their scripts, it's like, okay, so like, what's your background? Like, how'd you get here? It's like, well, I'd be lying if I didn't mention it. And that doesn't feel right either, especially in the vulnerability like conversation or getting a little bit about me. It's like, well, then I feel like I'm almost like walking around the truth to tell you how I got here. So enough of a peak that feels comfortable for you doesn't mean you're telling someone your whole life as well.
Well, okay. So, I mean, you're speaking to something that's very dear to my heart, which is what I consider real authenticity. By my definition, doing or saying what you would do or say when you would do or say it. I've shared most parts of my story at some point with somebody. And then there will be like somebody I'm like actually pretty close friends with, and they're like, oh my gosh, I didn't know that about you. And I'm like, really? I feel like I tell people that. But it's because there's, again, not that hard line. Like if you share something and I have something in common with that, then it will come up. I love to use this example because I had one coffee chat and we spent probably half of it, at least, so like a solid 15 minutes talking about betta fish. And I'm not sure how it came up, but like I'm allergic to everything. So the only pet I've ever had is betta fish, and I've had two of them, and they have their different stories and different personalities. And I was talking to this lady who also had betta fish. So then we had like something in common. I remember that person all the time. If you're watching, you know who you are because we talked about betta fish. But like because we talked about betta fish. One, I don't talk about betta fish to most people, but it was something that we had in common, that just the permission for it to come up was there. And I've talked to people about like much deeper, more traumatic things to me on podcasts and in conversations because it was relevant at the time. And that is what, again, we break down maybe this like strict allowance of what we're allowed to say in a networking event, right? Like I'm allowed to tell people what I do for business. I'm allowed to ask people what they do for business. And this is a business networking event, and we're going to talk about business. Then we lose all of that opportunity to create those more meaningful connections where, again, like my example, someone asks me, and I don't know, if you're an agency owner in my network who wants to be introduced to somebody, I have somebody who is looking for connections in your arena. But like, I can't think of you, right? I can't think of you, but I can think of you if you talk to me about betta fish, or you talk to me about a grief journey, or if you talk to me about like, those are pretty drastically different things, right? But there are things that are relevant to me. If you are nerd stuff is generally what connects with me, right? You know, people make Star Wars references or Lord of the Rings references, and I get them, and I'm like, yes, you're my people. We can have conversation. That might be the only thing we have in common, but we have that in common, and we allow each other to like build on that. I mean, I just think about this to extrapolate it back to the business scenario, right? I just think that like if you and I both have kids and we start talking about this experience that we have with them, and now we have that in common, and we like each other enough to continue having conversations, and then all of a sudden you're like, oh my God, I met this person and they like totally need somebody to help them with their marketing. I'm going to introduce you to them. I didn't have to know that person. Like they're those ecosystem effects that when we invest in one relationship, like you said, if you then can at any one given, let's use Dunbar's number because it's even smaller, right? Like if you can think of 150 people and like you and I'm one of them, then when that comes up, this is good for me. Okay? I want to be in your top 150.
Exactly.
People. I don't need to be in everybody's top 5. That's not possible.
No.
But how can I be memorable enough so that people remember me? And I mean, again, then it's like it sounds easy, but then we all have our own mindsets too of like what makes us memorable. And generally it's more complex than what actually makes us memorable, which is like ridiculous things like pink headphones. Right? This has worked out insanely well for me, and it was totally a happenstance that was me being frustrated with technology, right? Like, I don't know. And I didn't decide. I didn't decide what makes me memorable to you. You decide what makes me memorable to you. If I give you enough things that you might be able to resonate with, then you decide that I'm memorable. But at the end of the day, I feel like that's all you can do. And if your very end goal is still to make sales or to build a business or things like that, then don't you want people to know you for who you really are?
Exactly. Like, that's what I think, like, to sum it all up is like a connection point. Like, you don't know what, just in the same way as like you can't build a whole business on your own without actually taking those steps. You can think 11 steps ahead and think, oh, it's going to look like this. And then when you start taking them, step 4 and on is going to look completely different. And the only way you're going to find that out is if you actually take step 1, 2, and 3. I think it's the same thing. It's like you get these, like, gather these connection points, find a connection point so you actually just enjoy the conversation. And it could be 2 years later that something happens or something comes to fruition.
I had a client that from the time we met to the time we did business, it was 8 years.
Right.
We stayed in contact, and not because we were clients or anything. We stayed in contact for 8 years because we liked each other. And then all of a sudden she was like, I'm going to get a big round of investment in my business, and I want to make sure that we're doing our due diligence on marketing, and you're the one who has to do it. And I'm like, yeah, okay, great. Sounds fun. But like, and at the same time, from a business perspective, it doesn't have to be 8 years, right?
No.
Because the timelines for friendships and connections are not all the same. Because again, I don't control who needs what, but I actually create more opportunity if I show up like that from the beginning, and you happen to need that help today, then you're like, oh wow, okay, well, like, I didn't even know I needed that help today until you started ranting about all these things, and now this is making me think. And I'm a big fan of hanging out with people who like make each other think, right? Like, you make me think, I make you think. Together we solve problems in the world because we are not just not thinking, we're thinking. Exactly. And that's even that, right? I mean, now I feel like we could have a whole other hour-long conversation we could have about like, who are your people to like network, and how do you figure out like who those people are, and how you manage that, and how you create time for your people. But because we are coming up on the hour here, Xenia.
That's a part 2.
Part two, the power of networking. Stay tuned for that, folks. Of all of the things that we talked about here today, if there was one thing you would tell our lovely audience, that's something about networking that maybe they didn't think about before, what would that be? This is a very hard question.
I know. I really think it's as much as you can, taking all of those things that we talked about out of the equation to start. Like, really just start from a foundation of one shared common point. One commonality is all you need that can open up an ocean or a spider web or a DNA, whatever analogy you want to use or describe it, of possibilities and opportunities that you never thought possible. And I think creating your own opportunities is probably the biggest benefit that you'll receive from it, that you cannot see them. You can't think of all the possibilities. You can't see them until you start doing it. And the only way you're going to see them is to start doing it. So like, show up as yourself, find one point of connection, and like 6 months later, you'll look back and your entire life could be different.
Oh, so true. And if you are in the chat here today and you're like, oh, I don't have any of those people today, connect with me if we haven't already chatted. Connect with Xenia. Tell her that you saw her on the show, so she'll have a background of what you've heard her say before. But like, we are very good for practicing on, folks, because we are not I mean, we have a certain amount of time that's available for coffee chats. But hey, you want to have a coffee chat, get into the calendar, have a coffee chat, come practice on us, right? I feel like we're some of the easiest people to talk to, and especially if you're in this skill building zone, right? Networking is a skill. It is not something that people are innately good at or innately bad at. It is a skill that you build. And once you find some people that you can practice in front of, that makes it feel a little bit easier. Once you start to practice some of those, what would I do things as part of your networking repertoire, that this is a step-by-step build on it as you go. And Xenia and I are still building our styles and strategies and evolving them. This is an ongoing process. So connect with us or connect with each other, right? If you're here in a conversation about the power of networking, you should probably connect with each other. That's an easy one, right? Although we do have some LinkedIn users here. I'm going to figure out who you are after. I can only see LinkedIn user right now. But like connect with each other, have conversation, right? Practice the skills and be honest, right? Especially if you're connecting from this show. If this is something that you're newly venturing into, be honest. Hey, I'm practicing my networking skills. I really like to hop on a call and just like have a conversation to see how I do that.
Yeah.
Like at least the two of us will totally accept that. We want to support people building these skills.
Correct. Yes. I love it. Do it. Sign up.
And just like a LinkedIn user, I can't tell who you are. You can put your name in there if you want. But just reiterating the part about commonality, right? Mm-hmm. Like the commonality can be as simple as like we're both into networking. Right? Yeah. It doesn't have to be that complicated, right? Or if you heard something else that's another layer of commonality today, that's great. But you only need one. You need one to start a conversation. And you actually, I always like to share this because I remember having a conversation with a guy who had a map of England behind him. So I asked him, I was like, oh, hey, so you've got a map of the UK behind you. Are you from there? And he was like, no. And I was like, so why do you have a map of the UK behind you? And he was like, this is a good question. I don't really know. I felt like I needed something to fill up the space in my background. I was like, even that, we have something. We have something that's kind of funny. And like, seriously, and now I remember him always. Yes. Because I'm like, oh yeah, the random guy who had the UK behind him for no good reason. But like, oh, Maria. Hi, Maria. Good to see you. Yeah, I don't know. Sometimes the technology, like I said, sometimes it's our friend, sometimes it's not. But thank you, Xenia. I mean, like, literally, I feel like we could talk all day about this. And I want to thank Dan and Ellen and the LinkedIn users that were in the chat today. Oh, one of the LinkedIn users did say, is this being recorded? I'm arriving late. Yes. So once the live is finished, then you'll be able to watch it on replay on LinkedIn. It also will be on the Crazy Stupid Marketing Show page on YouTube, which I generally find is easier to find. So if you want to go back and find that Crazy Stupid Marketing Show, The Power of Networking on YouTube, you will find it. And I would love to hear what you think about the first half of the conversation, because it was just as good as the second half of the conversation. And as we've learned today, there's many more things that we can talk about when it comes to networking. So you guys just have to stay tuned to part two. Part two. It will be coming at some point, maybe September. The show gets booked out, friends. Okay, so this is a very important part of the show, my friends, and I've kind of already said to connect with each other already. But the power of networking and all the types of conversations that we talk about the Crazy Stupid Marketing Show, none of them have simple answers or easy to-dos. This isn't about being able to go away and just be like, just have a conversation. Because it sounds easy. It might not be easy for you based on your experience and all these other things. And so the point is to stay in the conversation, right? Connect with each other, get in conversation. Don't let this, if networking is a skill you want to build, don't let this be the last event you attend or conversation that you attend that is about networking. Don't let it be like, you need to attend a networking something, a coffee chat with a one-on-one or a group in person, if that's something that you like. You have to do the things. And so while it is great to come here and learn from experts who have done a lot of practicing in the arena, in order to get the skill, you have to practice. as well. So get out there and practice. If you're looking for places to practice, hit me up, hit Xenia up. We know lots of places where you can practice, and lots of people that are good with being practiced on, especially with networking. So just stay in the conversation. Xenia, thank you so much, my friend.
Thank you, my friend. I know.
Being in conversation with you. To everyone who is watching live, thank you so much for checking us out. To everybody who's watching the replay, thank you so much for checking us out. And if you have comments or questions for either myself or Xenia, please put them in the chat, tag us. We will come back and we will answer any additional questions that you have if you're watching the replay. And with that, everyone, until next time, permission to do you. Bye, everyone.